Thank you, everybody. For those of you thinking we came in early, that clock is fast. Slow. I'd say slow. We're on time. We're on internet time. All right. We'll just get our internet fired up and we'll get going in just a second. So this is a special meeting, which is in essence a continuation of our Wednesday marathon, where we went for about 7 hours and then deferred the actual discussion of the bylaw. And so this is, we have a regular meeting following this, but I suspect a lot of you are here for that first one. So we do acknowledge at the beginning of every meeting, either in writing or verbally, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish Lekwungen-speaking people, known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, and that their historic connection to this land continues to this day. You're live streamed, and also the video will be archived, and so, which means that people can see the back of your heads. All right. So, calling the meeting to order, we have an agenda, and there is a proposal, and I think it's based on a safe assumption that the discussions around the abstract proposal will take some time. And there is a proposal that the bylaws relating to the Marina, and there's really three aspects of that, which I'll come back to when we go into regular session, that those items be adjourned from here and referred to the regular meeting of council, which will start as soon as the special meeting is over. So
I would move refer items 5, 6, and 7 to the regular council meeting.
Second.
Thank you very much. Discussion? All in favor? Opposed? None opposed. All right. So now we're going to go right into then the special meeting, and it really will focus from here on in on the bylaws, and there's a number of them that relate to the abstract development. So let me first of all find out if any councillors have questions that need to be focused, and they need to have arisen as a result of the public hearing, what was said at the public hearings, any clarification, or arose from the public hearing materials that were before us. So once those questions, if there are any, have been clarified, then I'm going to invite a third reading on 4680, that bylaw, which essentially is the zoning bylaw. You will see that there's other bylaws on there, and we will get to them in sequence. Okay. So let's first of all see if there are any questions that have risen from the public hearing itself or the materials that were filed at the hearing. Okay. I don't see any hands. I'm going to invite third reading, following which I will invite debate.
Move third reading.
Okay. Moved and seconded. All right, it's on the floor. I think we all have things to say. We could do it as whoever puts their hands up, or we could just do it from one side to the other. Is there a preference? Just go around? Okay, who wants to start? Councillor Kirby or Councillor Braithwaite? And Councillor Braithwaite's pointing to you.
You're looking at me, I guess.
All right.
All right.
And what I'm going to suggest is that we say what we want the first time around, and then we use the second time around to reply to what we've heard from any other councillors or things that have kind of arisen as a result. Okay? Thank you very much. Councillor Kirby, please.
Okay. All right. My first point, I guess I'd make, is that if we can't build this here, if we can't build density into this community, as our 2014 OCP update has envisioned, the document that we all worked on and agreed on in the last term, and that this council said we, you know, as a strategic priority, we were going to bring into reality with changes in zoning and bylaws, things we haven't been able to get to as part of our work so far. But if we can't build this there, where can we build it? And for there to be 4 to 6 stories envisioned in the as far as like the zoning bylaws that will come up eventually when we do get to them, this OCP envisions this space as a 4 to 6 story building that we haven't, we don't have that zoning yet, but we will have that zoning eventually. And this is the space where we need, on busy corridors, we need to build housing. Because I think everyone is keenly aware that we have a housing crisis going on in this region. And I don't think it's fair that the rest of the region takes on that problem to solve without our help. I don't see it as being responsible to build anything less than this size of a building on this site. I understand from the many speakers we heard from last Wednesday night, the largest concern I heard was the size of the building and the parking. There's, in my opinion, we can't expect them to build anything smaller in a responsible way. When we have 79 new people in Oak Bay in the last 5 years, and our OCP says that we should be growing at 5% a year, that leaves us with a great gap to fill. Where are we going to do that? I don't want to do it in other parts of Oak Bay where the zoning doesn't allow it. This is the place where we need to build in density, and we need to do it responsibly. It's in keeping with the size of the buildings in the area, which that's why our OCP includes it at this height. And also, with respect to the neighbors, with respect to the fact that there's single-family dwellings across the street, I don't, in 50 years, imagine that it will look like that. I don't see that area remaining as single-family dwellings. And if we're building a building for 100 years, we need to envision what it will look like in 20 to 50 years, even 10 years, with the pressure that's on this region to grow. With 3,000 people arriving in the region every year, where are they going to go? Are we going to tear down the forests in around Goldstream? I don't want to see that. I think we actually live in a city, and responsible urbanization with an attractive building that provides a community hub, as the neighbors requested in all the planning meetings in the 18 months that went on of planning. That's what they asked for. They asked for commercial, small commercial spaces to allow for local businesses so that we can support local families and the local economy, as well as a gathering place with a friendly open space that's open to the public on the corner. And lastly, I think this, second lastly, I value the Gary Oak ecosystem, but I value homes for people more in this case. And I think we're going to see the tree canopy replaced, if not improved, by the addition of all the trees that they're planting. There's a total of 50 trees being planted on this site. I think that's impressive. I think this is the kind of development we want to see in Oak Bay, where we respect the tree canopy and replace it. When we're building in density and housing, we're doing it well. We're doing it to the highest standard. We're doing it to a high environmental standard. And this is a spot zoning. This is a single, there's no other site that looks like this. We're doing the best we can with the site that they have. And with regard to the parking issue, we have a 1986 parking bylaw. It's not 1986. We're looking into the future. We're all facing climate change. Most of the country is facing flash flooding and dramatic weather. this is climate change, you know, in its reality. It's here, it's happening. We have to do what we can to encourage people to get out of their cars. And when you've got an electric car to share amongst the strata, you've got electric bikes to share or available, you've got 70 spaces for 70 bikes, and enough parking for each, more than enough parking for each condo, given the statistics that we've seen in developments. This is, I think it's adequate. Downtown, they're not providing the same level of parking, and I think this is fair. And we live within 3 kilometers of downtown. This is where density and development needs to take place. It can't happen at the fringes of the community. We've pushed that urban boundary. That green space is threatened. We don't need to go any further. We don't need more development out in Souk and Goldstream. We need it in the city, and this is not that as bad as people say. I mean, I had some very challenging conversations, and I actually think this is an attractive building. I think it provides improvements to the intersection for walkability. It's miles ahead of where the site is right now. You can barely get around the building on Cadboro Bay Road because of the poles in the street and the overgrown shrubs and just the nature of the narrow sidewalks we used to build. This is a beautiful, gracious sidewalk that will allow the kids to travel back and forth safely from Willow School and the high school to the beach. It's to the neighborhood learning center. It's creating a hub in the community. It's building something out of nothing, because it truly is nothing there. You know, aside from 1 or 2 small businesses that seem to be surviving there right now, there's really nothing there. And, I respect that other people are concerned about change in the community, but we can't stop change. It's coming. Let's do it in a way that respects our values by making sure the tree canopy is protected, or is replaced, and that we provide housing that's desperately needed. I'm sure I'll have more to say later, but that's all I can think of at the moment.
Thank you very much. Councillor Zelka, please.
Thank you, Chair. As I've started a new job up on Keating Crossroads, my spirit is still catching up to me. It's halfway on the highway. I'd ask it to speak later on in the speaking order, please.
Sure, that can be accommodated, no problem. Councillor Nate, please.
Okay. I think I'll start off with just 3 points. To begin with, I just thank the developer for putting forward this challenging application. I appreciate it. To address and build this secondary village area, and that we know is a tired and failing commercial area. So I'm just going to speak to 3 things right now. First, I'm just going to speak to what I like about the project, and then I'd like to speak to the concerns that I've understood to be so for the residents, the adjacent residents, and then the concerns that I've understood to be expressed by the community at the public hearing and in my coffee shop sidewalk conversations with you. First of all, what I like about this proposal is that it provides us with an opportunity to increase our housing options in this community, so that those who wish to stay in the community and those who wish to enter the community have that opportunity to do so. And that was one of the key land framework focuses of the OCP that we did in 2013. And it also offers a housing stock with rentals and with no age restrictions, and I think that's key to add to the diversity of housing stock. And it has the potential here to bring a vibrancy and a vitality and traffic safety to this neighborhood, to be a real center for commercial and people interacting. And another thing that I really appreciate about the application, and I think is very key, is that the application has met, in my interpretation, as I understand in the notes provided by our planner, every site planning and building guideline in the OCP. It's met every single criterion. And I think that's a real important point, given that the OCP is the driving document that steers what this project is all about. So it leaves us with a project that is potentially sustainable and compact. It addresses housing diversity. It's got an extraordinary landscape plan in my view. It's offered amenities to increase pedestrian and vehicular safety. I think there's been some very significant consideration of the experience of the adjacent neighbors. So the second point I wanted to speak to right now was just the experience of the neighbors. And I do want to say I really appreciate the openness and hospitality of the neighbors because I've walked up and down the street, I've had my measuring tape, and people have opened their door to me to help me understand their experience of this proposal to their everyday life. So thank you, genuinely thank you for trusting me to let me understand what those experiences are. We know that the consultants have made an effort to connect with the local residents, so that this has been kind of a bottom-up, not all attended, but it's clear that the applicant has made an effort to understand what the neighbors in that area have wanted to do. The applicant has done a number of things since the original, the ADP saw the first drawings to address this experience of the adjacent neighbors. And I don't think these are insignificant alterations to the project, and they are all in keeping with the guidelines in our OCP. They've tiered the building at the west end to make it a better transition to the existing multi-residential property. They've created a setback on that top floor to mitigate the shadowing to the adjacent neighbors. They've widened the sidewalk a couple of times and increased the landscaping on that street. They've also created a townhouse facade at the front to give it a more neighborly kind of experience in that neighborhood. And then, of course, they've set back the ground floor to increase that space for the pedestrian experience. One of the issues that doesn't go away for the neighbors is the height of the building. And I really do understand this. I've been in a neighborhood where we've had other development, and I appreciate the uncertainty that comes with this kind of disruption to the neighborhood. But I've also tried to understand what we've done in this neighborhood. And when I look over at the Carlton, which was a very controversial project that sets 53 feet on the Chaucer side, on the north side of the Carlton, where a residential area is, we have a similar experience where the residents are across the street from a building that towers up 53 feet. Bear in mind, the applicant has brought this down to, I believe it's 46. It might be, I think it's 46 feet, might be 43, but it's certainly lower than 53. And over on Newport, there's a building called Newport Ocean, and Beresford Street flanks that, where there's then residential properties across the street. And that's a 5-story building. And of course, there's the Whitehall on Beach Drive, and that's a 10-story building, and then that flanks a residential area on Deal Street. And we also had, of course, the Oak Bay Lodge that was had a proposal to be 6 stories that flanks the residents, adjacent residents on Hampshire. So my point in saying this is not to really defend high buildings around residential areas, but to say that this happens in Oak Bay, where buildings are trying to create, some of these have created transitions into neighborhoods because we don't have transition zoning from commercial or multi-resident into our residential areas. So my point really here is that it's a difficult experience for the neighbors, but I'm really quite confident these features that the applicant has added to this side of the property will create the transition to the adjacent neighborhoods that will not significantly negatively impact their properties, and potentially down the road, I hypothesize that it will actually improve that neighborhood experience. To the community concerns that I've heard issues around parking, traffic, the green space, and of course the density. The parking issue, Councillor Kirby has brought that up. I think that's going to be, we've got a variance on the parking. It's a very old parking bylaw. It's not a bylaw that respects modern day sort of reduced usage of cars. And quite honestly, I can't believe somebody would purchase a property here, somebody who had 3 cars when they've only got 1 parking space. So I'm confident that the purchaser of a unit in this proposal would be either have the 1 car or prepared to use the common electric car that is being proposed to be a part of the strata. In terms of traffic, I'm confident that the 2009 Bunk report is going to address the existing traffic issues. The applicant has offered to put $100,000 towards that, and that will significantly slow the traffic down. Even though there's going to be more traffic, I'm confident, having talked with our engineer and read in the report of option 2, that that will address the traffic concerns. And on the green capacity, I think this is quite a remarkable plan, quite frankly. We've got 13% more canopy on-site, and we've got 20% more off-site that currently exists. And those numbers far exceed the expectation that we've set in our urban forest strategy of on the former of 30% and 200% exceeding the expectation on the off-site. So, and to add to that, the applicant has got these containers that are bigger than any containers in the city, as I understand, that really provide a realistic opportunity for the livability of these plantings. So I'm very impressed with that. On the point of density, which as I heard at the hearing is really the number 1 issue, is you've got the FAR of 2.85, but that's not the metric that I think is relevant because of the nature of the lot. It's awkward. It's really it's more for the metric that I use is the context. And when I see the footprint of this building next to existing multi-residential properties, I find it reasonable. It's a bit bigger, the footprint-wise, but we would expect that given it's a new building compared to the buildings that were built 50 years ago. The setbacks that people have been concerned about, there's numerous setbacks on the property. One of them is as much as, I believe, 39 feet at the corner of the property, and then there's other ones throughout the property on the bottom level. And there's also tiering on the top. And these features have mitigate the the massing experience for the pedestrians. And I think they've been quite successful in introducing those, and and the result is satisfactory in my mind on the Cadboro Bay side. The part of the building that has most bothered me is what many have called the nose, or the beak of the property, that place at the point. And I've worked hard to try to understand that experience, because a lot of people say that it's overbearing. And I've understood, I've come to understand the evolution of that and the efforts that the designer, the architects, has made to work that corner piece. And I've come to understand that it's a very challenging piece of work to do. And I've decided that really this is a design issue, and I've gone back to read our ADP report, and they have supported this part of the property. And I've heard people who really like it, and I've talked to people who really don't like it. So as far as that goes, it's a design issue. Some of us like Picasso's and some of us don't. When it comes to artwork, we're always going to introduce the notion of subjectivity, and I'm going to leave it to the experts on our design panel, and the architect who came to this, who spent probably 10 years at university trying to do this and has a phenomenal reputation. I guess my final comment on that part of it is that as I've thought about that part of the project, is that I can see that the statement that's being made there is kind of a bookend to this corridor that we've got marked out as a multi-residential and some institutional. And this project, if it went through tonight, would mark the beginning of that. And so I'm satisfied that it's going to work in time. And as I look forward, as I look into the future, I feel like it will work. I guess my final comments right now really are that when I think about the density, and if I think about our land use frameworks of the past, it's a big, dense project. But if I take up the vision of the OCP and I think forward in time, I think this is a fitting project that will serve our community very well in the future. So those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Councillor Nate. Councillor Murdoch, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I really appreciate the comments that have been made so far, and I think a lot of this does recognize the difficulties of that very specific site and what we're considering here. I've spoken to my concerns in previous council meetings, so maybe everybody here hasn't heard them, but we have to make the decision tonight, so we'll just try not to get back into all the details. But I just thought I'd spend a bit of time clarifying some of my thoughts and ongoing concerns, and why I'm still continuing to struggle a little bit with this project as it's presented here in front of us. I also want to just state how much I appreciate all the presentations and stuff from the public, from the applicant at the public hearing. I really, despite a 7-hour marathon, it's so nice to have everybody who actually cares about the community all expressing their opinions on stuff. It's really, everybody's coming at it from the right spot and very respectful, and I really, as painful as that was, it's nice to at least have it as a positive approach. So, in fact, I was thinking about this, if I wasn't on council, if I was just a person in the street, knowing Mr. Miller through the school that our kids go to, and seeing the presentation, I would probably have been at the mic expressing my support for it, because I do think the community needs redevelopment. I think that this is a logical place for increased density, and I think there's lots of positive aspects. But that's not my job. My job is to be a councillor and to look at this from the broader perspective of the community, and to look at the planning aspects and so forth. So I still want to identify some of the concerns I have, and I'd love to have people make notes and respond to them, because I think I have a hard time getting past them to vote in favor. So I'd like to hear how people have come to that conclusion. I also want to reiterate something I have said before, but I think it's really important, is because it ties into other comments. I really think that the benefit of proper community planning, it couldn't have a more clear evidentiary moment than this. It's, good planning just makes better decision making and better community buy-in. It's also very pro-development. I think everybody, from the applicant to the neighbors, appreciate having clear guidelines to work with, and neighbors certainly appreciate having a fairly sufficient understanding that things aren't going to change unreasonably across the street from them or beside them. So I think that I still believe quite strongly that we're going to have to get down to the brass tacks of it and actually come up with a community plan, because it would help us as council with these guidelines. The good news, of course, is that the whole community does seem to agree that this should be developed. The bad news is that without those guidelines, we seem to be measuring the appropriateness of this by a bit of the seat of our pants, how it feels, and trying to interpret the vague wording of the OCP. So I want to just touch on the OCP first. It does, as a document, tend to articulate values, where we listed all the things that we value as a community, but doesn't get too far into land use rules. The closest we have here is the staff's report saying it's not inconsistent with the OCP, but it doesn't give us an awful lot of specific guidance. So I want to touch on a few of the specific things it does talk on in terms of its guidelines, because it does say a few things, although not terribly clear. One, though, it does speak specifically to the development of secondary village sites. And it says that, I'm going to quote here from the OCP, for buildings over 2 stories, use setbacks or terracing above the second level to reduce massing impacts on the street, to allow sunlight penetration and to retain the scale of oak-based commercial areas. It says retain and conserve as much natural vegetation, rock outcrops, existing hydrology, and unique site features as possible, including Gary oaks, other large trees, and significant vegetation. And it says incorporate outdoor amenities such as benches, courtyards, food gardens, dog relief areas, and recreation facilities to provide opportunities for residents to socialize and to contribute to a sense of community. Now, we did hear in the presentation that, and Councillor Kirby touched on this, the OCP specifically says that secondary villages are low to mid-rise buildings, without giving specifics of that. It also, later on, under the land use framework, details low to mid-rise buildings as under 6 stories. So or ultimately as high as 6 stories, if we take the highest of the mid-rise buildings. So you could argue this is small for what's allowed at that building. But you have to actually read the OCP in detail here. And what that is under the land use frameworks in section 4. Right after it says that maximum height of 6 stories for medium or mid-rise buildings, the next line starts with the explanation that that height is related to the FAR. The high building must cover less of the lot, has to allow setbacks to offset that height. You can't talk about height without also talking about the floor area ratio. And I would point out here that I think it's important to recognize, because some of they've been used examples, the 6-story buildings in the mid-rise developments are an FAR of 1 to 1.5. The 10 stories are 1.5. This is a 3 or 2.8 to 1 ratio. So it's between 2 and 3 times more massive than those 6 to 10-story buildings that we have in the community. So I think it's just something to realize within the context of what we're talking about here. The OCP does talk about height, but it also talks about floor area ratio, setbacks, lot coverage, and so forth as a complete picture. And that's how we have to look at this. And that's why FAR is used, because typically, I mean, by its own design, the higher, the smaller the footprint, the more green space allowed. And certainly that allows for the setbacks from single-family homes and other neighbors. And I also would just like to reiterate on the Advisory Planning Commission notes that we have is that, again, they approved this, they moved it forward to council, but they did raise specific unresolved concerns regarding the overall massing of the building, its scale within the neighborhood, the height of the development at the corner of Cadboro Bay and Bowker, the transition of the proposal with the adjacent single-family and multifamily developments, the impact on the reduction in parking. In addition, the Commission reiterated concern regarding the lack of affordable, inclusive housing and determined that the community amenity contribution as proposed was not in keeping with the scale and the impact of the development. So I'm not sure we've resolved their concerns as part of this application. So I'm just going to talk about some of the smaller aspects of this that I think I still would like to see addressed, but I'd like to hear from other councillors on this. The parking, and I actually agree with the other councillors that have spoken already. I believe that the residential parking aspect of this will be largely self-regulated. If there's not room in the building for people to park their cars and they want lots of cars, they're not going to choose this building. I'm reasonably okay with that. I do have significant problems with the 7 spots for 6 or 5 commercial stores and 1 restaurant. They are going to drive a fair bit of business. I certainly hope they do, just to see the business is successful. And if I look at things that cause dangerous cars and bike interactions and so forth, a lot of it is circling around, desperate to find parking, the contention for parking spots, and the lack of available parking. So I would like to see that better addressed. 2, the tree coverage. I really do appreciate the work that's gone into that. I agree that the soil volumes allocated is all very impressive. It's still not, it's going to be essentially, because they're just planted in holes in the ground, essentially a non-green space with tree spire. So when you're walking down that street, it's not going to feel green. It's going to feel very much like a little concrete pathway going through. So I still have concerns about that. I'm not sure how that's addressable without seeing setbacks, frankly, because you just can't plant things otherwise. The height, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, we've talked about this, really in context with the setbacks and so forth. The maximum height, both along Bowker and along Cadboro Bay, I feel is going to feel very, very tall and looming. It's a very tall building to be that close to when you're on the sidewalks. And the setbacks, I thought that some of the slides showing both the applicants and the neighbors were very telling. Even with the 4-foot setback on the first floor as well, that public line 4 feet from people's windows, it's just not a lot of privacy. People want to walk into that garden area, it's not much privacy. I mean, my vision here is that those windows are going to have their blinds drawn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week just to keep privacy in their homes. I probably would. Then those are sort of the minor issues I still have concerns with. The crux of my opposition is really that, looking at this application and trying to get some sense of what's reasonable or not reasonable, I had to go outside of Oak Bay because we don't have the specific guidelines to what we allow and don't allow in these areas. So this is a small secondary village, not a big one. But I want to point out that this building exceeds the city of Victoria's. They have a large secondary village, which is Oak Bay Avenue and Cook Street Village, in terms of their size and compensation rules. So their rules are, they still have setbacks, they have a maximum FAR of 1.5, and rentals being removed must be replaced with units. And in many cases, I don't know about Oak Bay Avenue, but certainly at Cook Street Village, any place where the FAR exceeds 1.5, they have an absolute max of 2.5. There is very specific compensation allocated. In fact, it's 75% of the increased value of the property over that 1.5 as a community amenity contribution. I'm going to use as an example, probably because it's recent. In December of last year, there was a development that was fairly controversial in Cook Street Village that went forward. It ended up being voted through after some changes by the council in a split vote. That was also a difficult building in that it was a smallish lot with a narrow-tipped angled point on it. That was their large urban village with a mix of commercial and residential. The approved building that was controversial there had an FAR of 2.2. It had a lot coverage of 50%. So this is 27% larger and covers 77% more of the lot. The Cook Street application also provided setbacks on all the sides, and the developer was required to pay the difference on the piece there. So in that case, in fairness, they actually negotiated a piece where 30%, a little over 30% of the suites were designated as rentals. Not that they wouldn't be rentals prohibitive, but it were actually formally rental suites, so it guaranteed rental stock. And more than half of those were actually below market rentals, so the developer subsidized the cost of those to provide them at below market rates. To my mind, that's kind of the reasonable approach I would like to see with the planning process here. But I also want to point out that it's not being parochial or small-minded to keep development to reasonable proportions. Every jurisdiction does it. Every jurisdiction is required to set the size limitations and massing of buildings. Unfortunately, what we have here is we're forced into a situation without those of having to guess what's appropriate. So I'll leave that for that. The impact of setbacks, most buildings do require setbacks. In fact, they all have setbacks. So we have setbacks in this case as well. What we have, though, is we have them coming out of the public land. So because they have no setbacks on the Cadboro Bay side, we have to have the green plantings on the street. On Bowker, we have to donate land for gardens and so forth up against the building. So there's a fairly large amount of land, being required to be given away here. Not given away, but being used for what would normally be used for setbacks. And I think it's something to just be considering in terms of our overall value that we're giving here. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's a fairly substantial amount of property to actually get to. And finally, on the setbacks, I need to consider the impact of zoning on its neighbors, because we don't just have the setbacks, which we talked about a lot on the approximately 500 feet of frontage, but we also have 18-inch setbacks facing the adjacent multifamily buildings. My concern here is that if those buildings are developed, they'll have to accommodate a substantial side yard setback to allow their tenants any privacy. The other option, of course, is that they would just also build a 4 to 5 story vertical wall 18 inches from the property line, and that would just create a single line of buildings down Bowker, or Cadboro Bay, my final concern, which is precedence, and not just in the sort of lowercase abstract, but as in this will be other larger buildings. I thought the former mayor, Chris Costin, spoke quite eloquently that it does set a precedence because it is a condo building, but even recognizing the difficulty of this one property, I think that this essentially sets a standard that existing buildings can be built right up against the sidewalk and right up against side yards. I think you could argue that the 88.7% lot coverage doesn't necessarily, because you could make arguments for the triangular nature of the lot, but I still think that the significant increase of that, more than twice what's allowed currently, does set a fair bit of precedent. If you think about this logically, if these standards are set as a standard, 88% lot coverage all the way through that triangle between East Down and Cadboro Bay Road, we're really looking at zero green space for that entire block. And I think that is, I have a very hard time, honestly, moving that forward because we haven't set the plan. We are essentially doing it ad hoc. So I don't know. Those are my concerns. I'm really happy to hear from other councillors in terms of how they get past them. I think there's a good quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a Canadian diplomat and economist, who said that politics is not the art of the possible. It consists of choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. And that's kind of how I feel right now with this application. I don't think it's fair to the applicant to turn it back at this point. I think all these changes should have been made earlier, but I also have to recognize that the worst pass here, to my mind still, unless I hear differently, is that going down this community planning process without the community plan in place can cause all kinds of grief that I don't want to see. So, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we're going to keep going, or would you like us? Oh, yep. Okay. Pardon me.
Your Honor, I think it would be appropriate if Mr. Zelka spoke now. Thank you.
Are you ready now to almost? All right. So, Councillor Croft, he's almost ready. You are ready. We're going to go with you.
Okay, thank you. I too really appreciated the input of the community last Wednesday night. It was a long evening. The presentation by the applicant and his proponents, as well as all of the very thoughtful information that was provided by the community. I was overwhelmed by your understanding and knowledge of the process and what we're about here as councillors. I have a lot of notes. My presentation goes back to the very beginning of this. Under land use, land is the scarce resource. how we use the land allows us to then develop what we have upon the land to provide housing. And the scarce of the resource, which we have in this community right now, is the need for increased density in those areas where we can increase it. Not only do we have a very interesting corner here that one of the neighbors pointed out is probably the junction of the Hudson's Bay Trail and the road to the Todd Farm. I suspect that the First Nations probably had trails through here long before that. And the significance of this corner in our community is very important. And when you deal with a flat iron building like this one, then you want to do is create something that marks the corner for its significance over time and into the future. And I believe that this building meets the criteria that would establish that kind of marking the corner. I think that it is a very good use of the land. As you know, I do sit on the advisory design panel, and the advisory design panel actually at one point asked the applicant why he didn't come forward with a 5-story building on Cadboro Bay and reducing Bowker even further, and he very carefully said because he didn't think it would receive the support at that level. And he's also set back the levels both on the 4th floor on Cadboro Bay and the 3rd floor on Bowker. I kind of view this building maybe a little differently. I think that on the west side of the building, of the property, we have a 4-story building, which is similar to the existing 4-story buildings that were built back in the late 60s and early 70s. It then moves forward, and that building is over top of a completely covered parkade. It then moves eastward with a commercial level and then 3 levels of residential, of which the top level is stepped back slightly. It turns the corner and we have another zone, which is the parking zone, and above that we have 2.5 levels of residential, having a very nice step back for that area. The way that we calculate our floor area ratio is different than other municipalities, so I appreciate what Councillor Murdoch has pointed out, the City of Victoria, but they don't use some of the things that we do. So I think it's very difficult when you compare municipalities to municipalities. I think it's very good if we just stick to our municipality and look at this in context of what's being offered by the developer to the community. If we reduce the size of the building, we talk about affordability, and what'll happen is if you reduce the size of the building is you push up the price of the units because there's a certain cost to build and a certain profit that has to be made to build one of these buildings. So I'm hearing what people are saying. I hear about the setbacks. One must remember that the existing commercial building has no setbacks. We have to talk about massing, and I think that the developer in the design of the building and the materials that are going to be used on the outside of the building are going to mitigate some of this massing once it gets built. We're talking about parking. We ought to remember that parking on the street belongs to everybody. It's the biggest single asset that a community has are the roads, and all of the roads belong to all of us to use as we see fit when we choose to use them. And traffic at the corner has been addressed, and I think it'll be continually addressed by staff as this project moves forward. So I will leave my remarks there, and again, I thank everybody for their comments the other night.
There's another councillor pointing towards you now. That's Councillor Braithwaite's pointing towards you, Councillor Zelko. So if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'm here now. Thank you so much. And I have had a chance to listen to all of my colleagues' most valuable comments and observations, and I wish to share at this time my own. Thank you so much. The OCP that we have is an excellent document. I want to commend the work that was done by the previous council on that, and I wish to make it very clear that I want to support the objectives and what's being put forward for the vision for Oak Bay. This building site is I have to agree with both the proponent and many people who came to the public hearing, is challenging. With respect to the size of other secondary villages, it's rather small. However, it's been designated secondary village. And on one or possibly 2 sides, it is, and according to the OCP, will have much higher densities. I have to say right off at the very beginning that the density as being proposed for this site is supportable, is defensible. And I want to commend the proponent for bringing forward something that can actually potentially achieve the density of a secondary village. However, it's a challenging site. I noted that the OCP also has a different designation for what's called a corner commercial with a lower height recommendation. This secondary village site, unfortunately, as I think pointed out a few moments ago, is often referred to as a flat iron building type site, which I see a corner commercial being kind of part of it. So corner commercial calls for a low-rise multi-unit building. Secondary village calls for a low to mid-rise multi-unit building. However, I still have to say that the density is defensible. When I go to the OCP and I go to the appendices and I look at what's planned for the area around this secondary village, what I see is to the immediate south is community institutional, which, as we already know with the Oak Bay Lodge and its replacement building, I doubt it's going to get any shorter. So transition, I don't see a transition problem at all with either current or future usage for community institutional. The properties to the immediate west are designated in our OCP as multi-unit residential. I have no problems with the transition between this building and the heights as proposed with the future plans for the replacement of those buildings. I imagine they may be higher. However, as pointed out by one of my colleagues, what might be a deficiency in our OCP, possibly, is that we have a transition problem here. To the immediate north is established neighborhoods. The maximum that can possibly be built in an established neighborhood, according to our OCP, not yet according to our zoning, but according to our OCP, will one day be triplexes. However, it still reflects the original designation of this area, which is single-family homes. I see a real problem with the transition between this building and the current and future usage of the properties to the north. And I haven't resolved that yet in my mind. The height of the building facing the north, the shadowing of the building facing the north, I'm very, very concerned for those who live on Bowker across the street, and I think their needs need to be accommodated somehow. I'm not quite sure how yet. So let's just say that I have a transition reservation with respect to the properties to the north. Most people know that I hate boxy square houses, and I have to admit that extends to boxy square buildings. The style of this building, as pointed out by the advisory design panel, it's not extreme West Coast. It's referred to as brutalist. It's its official designation as an architectural style. Some on social media and some at the public hearing made reference to this being the Bowker bunker as their definition of the sort of general style of this building. As pointed out in the advisory design panel, in their first meeting where they were asked for their comments, the first comment came up was that question about the cliff face facing to the north. That touches back on my question about the transition zone. The cliff face facing north. It's a challenge for transitioning to the smaller homes on Bowker Avenue, says a panel member on the advisory design panel. I have to agree with that comment. The lanterns in these in the style and design of this panel. In and amongst the brutalist architecture, I'm sorry I have to touch upon design as well as land use, even though, if you will indulge me, Chair, even though we're really touching upon land use in particular, if we approve this and go forward, essentially the design of the building is fixed. So I have to speak to the design at this point because there is no other appropriate time. I dislike the lanterns as pointed out in the various designs. To me, they read as watchtowers. To me, they read as especially the cliff face facing north, using the terminology from the design panel, as impositions on privacy and overlooking, especially the single-family homes facing to the north. I appreciate very much the work that was done on the Bowker wing with respect to that aspect, how it was pulled back a bit, and it was not exactly terraced, but articulated in such a way that, to my view, it ended up being acceptable to me. It fell within the acceptable bounds, even with the updated shading study. I noticed that the first shading study we received did not quite point out the fact that there's a 5th floor and a 4th floor difference in the shading on the Bowker homes. But the updated shading study thankfully did. And I can see quite clearly that for half a year, the houses on Bowker, especially closer to Cadboro Bay, will be in quite an amount of shade that I find a concern. I'm generally concerned with the setbacks. I'm generally concerned with the lack of terracing in the other parts of the building. And I'll get to some aspects of that in a moment. One of the items that I was very pleased to learn in the public hearing was the lack of provision made for servicing the commercial aspects of the building. I hadn't really noticed that. So the fact that there's no back alley to speak of, there doesn't appear to be a way that that a semi or a tractor trailer can be, find some spot where it can be put so as not to disturb the residential aspects of the neighborhood. I appreciate the mixed usage of the building. In fact, I want to enhance the mixed usability if there's any way possible. But I did note that maybe, possibly with the size of the building, possibly with the site coverage, no provision was made to service the commercial aspects of the building, and that to me feels, with respect to the facade facing north, with respect to the shadowing, and this to me feels as a further imposition, especially on the residential nature of the properties to the north. I'm concerned about that. I have to agree with the comments put forward by my colleagues with respect to FAR and height. The OCP does talk about the two being in balance, and it seems to me both have been taken to the extreme in this case. I do want to repeat, I can, and I do wish to defend the density of the secondary usage of this building. I just wish, maybe in concert with some of the comments received by our wonderful volunteers, that maybe the building could be possibly higher and yet skinnier. So we could possibly get some setbacks returned. We could possibly get some trees returned. We could possibly get maybe those floors already at the top on what I call the 5th floor with respect to the nose, terraced back, and maybe a 6th floor terraced back even further. If this building truly read, to me, as a 3- or 4-story building, in some ways, not unlike the Village Walk. Village Walk is described as a 4-story building, but from anyone who's anywhere near this building, unless you are very, very far away from the building, it reads as a 3-story building. And to me, that is very a defensible and a reasonable adjustment to make to a building to bring it down to a human scale, especially with respect to a transition zone. In particular, I'm now talking about the nose aspect. It's referred to as the nose facing north. That contributes to the cliff face facing north. I wish there was a way that we could work, that we get messages through somehow in a way that that didn't, in some ways, put us in conflict of issues. I wish there was some other way that we could work with the developer to give a better feel for where we're at and where we're not at. Unfortunately, we have restrictions with respect to the various acts that we have to work under. What we're being presented here is a proposal. All we can do is vote it up or vote it down. I would like to make it clear that while I can defend and can support many of the aspects of this building that will contribute to a good business plan and a good return on investment for the developer, I am concerned greatly with respect to the lack of setbacks, the height, the fact that the building does not actually follow, in my humble opinion, all of the aspects of the OCP. Some of the points have been mentioned already with respect to the fact that the OCP calls for the building to be terraced above the second floor. It calls for it to be set back, not unlike what we saw in Village Walk. That's what our OCP calls for, even without a transition zone. Maybe that was the replacement for the transition zone. I'm not sure. This building doesn't have that. I have to wonder, whether possibly that nose section, I just have to wonder out loud whether that nose section could possibly be picked up, turned, and put over closer to the secret garden, or whatever that thing is called in the center of the triangle. I have to wonder whether that might be a better solution, so that the building then actually, as the OCP calls for, follows the topography of the site. It starts high, closer to the school, and ends low down at Bowker. But the building right now is a flat roof. Our OCP asks that buildings, especially multi-story secondary villages, respect the topography. That's another area that this building does not follow our OCP. I am worried about the impact of this building also. The impact on the community, and how do I say this? I'm up here, we're all up here representing the citizens of Oak Bay and the public purse, et cetera, and the land usage of the community. A great number of variances and adjustments are being asked from what is already in existence on this site. I appreciate some of the community amenities already made, but I also very much appreciate what we are allowed to ask for. And I wish we have, and I'm looking forward to when we actually have finished our OCP and we have the guidelines in place. I'm looking forward to having this community amenity document turned into official policy within Oak Bay. We don't have that, and I think that was part of the rationale behind bringing on more staff, bringing on more expertise, so that while we're in transition to our modern OCP, that we can maybe take advantage of all of the types of community amenities we can have, so that it's a true win-win. And what I'm referring to with respect to impact is, I feel, I'd have to, on the balance of things, I wonder whether it's in proportion or not. I worry that the impact of the community with respect to the benefit is not fully in proportion. Hence, the community amenities is really to adjust those things. I would have loved to have seen this truly being a mixed usage building. It's not. There are no dedicated rentals in this building. I see that as lacking. I wish that we had the policies in place to guide our staff on the negotiations, to say that there is a desire to have the commercial, to have the strata, but to also have the dedicated rental. And I see that as being lacking in this building. We are putting people who are in a rental situation out of their homes with this. We have the mechanisms for putting them back into a home. I don't know why we didn't take advantage of that. So I don't understand that. So I'm still wondering about that one. So I do have some concerns with this building, but I also am very thrilled to see this building come forward because I do want to see more people moving into Oak Bay. And I can see that this building, as I heard very clearly at the public hearing, there is an appetite. There is a desire. There is an aspiration for people's children, for people to age into the building, et cetera, et cetera. The last point I'm going to make, which might truly, I'll have to go into depth when on the next item in the agenda, depending on the outcome of this one, has to do with the housing agreement. It touches on community amenities. I'm very glad to see that one of the offers on the condo owner is that built into their strata bylaws is going to be, I think it's referred to as unrestricted rentals. Well, what many strata owners have discovered across British Columbia is that when you open up to rentals, unfortunately, as I say, as many strata owners have discovered, is that there is a severe confusion in people's minds between a short-term hotel-like stay, which is a business usage, versus a rental tenancy, which is not a business usage. And I'm very wish to support those aspirational folks who would like to see rentals in this building, but I do not see any protection for those aspirations being protected and the whole building being used, for example, in the worst case, as Airbnb, under the auspices of no limitations on rentals. And that'll a question I will bring forward at the appropriate time should this get move forward. Those are my comments at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Braithwaite, please.
Thank you so much. There's a lot that's been said already that I won't reiterate, but like my fellow councillors, there's a lot I would like to defend and support many aspects of this particular application. And like many who spoke last week, I'm really in support of thoughtful development and infill, and I believe it is important to keep our company vibrant and inclusive. And so I just really wish that this development had come to us with a more measured and a realistic approach or a proposal. I do want to make a quick point about process because I think it was brought up at the public hearing that the applicant feels that this proposal has been in place for a very long period of time, from the time that they purchased the original building in 2013 to now, which they consider 4 years. I think it's really important that we point out to people that this proposal has only been in front of council since January 17th of this year. That's 4 months. That's not a long time, in my mind, for us to have a look at a proposal like this. There are houses in Oak Bay that take longer than that, with a few variances, to go through their process. So, to me, I find it interesting that we talk about how long this proposal has taken, because I truly feel that it has not taken a very long period of time at all. Again, it's only been in front of us for 4 months. It's really our responsibility as elected officials to ensure that what we allow to be built is within our current bylaws. It fits in with our OCP, as we've heard, and augments the streetscapes and aesthetics of what's already here. You don't have to look far, I don't think, to see what ignoring or not following these steps can do to a neighborhood or a community. When done well, we all know that development enhances the livability and accessibility of our community. When not done well, it turns a community into something that's unlivable and something that could have devastating long-term effects. One of the letters that we received in our packages last week said it really well. They said, and I quote, "Let's learn from the mistakes and successes of other towns and places of similar nature to Oak Bay and build a strong strategic plan of growth for our community, one based on thorough research and study, high aesthetic and functional standards, all the while catering as efficiently as possible for the social needs of the community." I would really have to agree with that. But I, like others, commend the applicant for taking on this site. It truly is a challenging one. But again, as has been pointed out, they knew that going in, and I would assume that they took that into consideration prior to purchasing it. So when we do look at this site, I think that we all are willing to give some concession based on the shape of the site and what a redevelopment would bring to this corner and area of Oak Bay. However, I think we still have to balance that with what will fit in with the neighborhood and how it fits in with our OCP. And we've already heard people talk about our OCP as far as the terracing of the second level, the setbacks to reduce the massing, etc. Again, this building, I think, will add a lot of traffic volume to this corner, and it's a very congested intersection already. As I've stated before, I think that if there's an issue with this corner, we as a municipality should be taking care of that now, whether or not this proposal goes forward. So we need to fix that if there's something wrong with it. There's really so many positives about this proposal, I think. You know, they have a great stormwater management system. There's going to be new space for businesses, new residences. It offers good options for new buyers. But there's also some negatives, as has been pointed out. It's going to be the most dense building in Oak Bay. There's no or limited setbacks. There's not enough parking. It's a huge massing. It gives a loss of character, a loss of trees, which I think has been talked about a little bit about the tree canopy will be replaced to 20% more than what is there already. But I think, again, as has been pointed out in prior meetings, that tree canopy will not come into being for another 30 to 50 years. So in that time, we lose that tree canopy that we have right now. So those are all things that we heard the other night and all important things to consider when we make this decision. I support change in our community and would support this development if it was more measured and realistic. The building, I feel, as proposed, isn't compatible with the neighborhood, visually or functionally, and for that reason, I'm going to have to vote against it moving forward. But I would hope that this applicant would come back with a proposal that takes into account our current bylaws and respects our site coverage expectations and our urban forest strategies. I think that the OCP survey, when it was given, asked specifically about housing types for Oak Bay, and it said, assuming key issues such as tree protection, parking, traffic noise, and neighborhood character will be addressed. I don't think that, to me, these are not being addressed to the extent they should be with this proposal. As been mentioned already, I think former Mayor Costin pointed out the other night, if this is allowed to go ahead, it could become the new normal. And I don't personally think that that's what most residents want, is this to be our new normal. And I think that if you like where you live and you appreciate everything you've got, you want to protect that. And I want to protect that moving forward. And I think it's our job sitting around this table to protect that and look for something that's a little bit less imposing to be put on this corner. I hope that the applicant, as I said, brings back something to the table that would fit more kindly with our vision for our community. I think we should push pause, and I think we do have to get Bowker right. I just don't think that this is the correct building to get this right. And so unfortunately, it really hurts me that I can't support this proposal moving forward at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, are there any second-time speakers who wish to address any of the issues that were raised? All right, thank you very much. Go ahead, please. Councillor Kirby.
I just wanted to address, I heard several times mention of the FAR and the site coverage and the density being too high, and that with this building being built right to the frontage, that's not a precedent we want to accept in Oak Bay going forward. But I think we heard over and over and over again, like even the folks that were opposed to the design of this particular building, or they saw some issues with it. Just about everybody agreed that we do need density, we do need to densify, and that this is an appropriate place for it. We can't have it both ways. We can't have density on a major thoroughfare and commercial property that will create some vibrancy for the neighborhood, will create a commercial and social hub for all the multifamily around it, because again, the plan does have that the rest of Cadboro Bay, going towards the high school on both sides, would have multifamily units, residential, but there will be no commercial in those ones. So this is the only kind of commercial site. And commercial, I think we've come to learn from all the presentations we've heard over the years that commercial thrives on having connection at the street level. So they can't be successful if they're too far back, if they're too far removed from the streetscape, and we need to improve that streetscape. This project does that. It provides, street furniture and green space. I heard Councillor Murdoch say that this is a concrete pathway, and that's all you'd see. But as far as I can see from the landscape plan, there are planters that border both the sidewalks, and there are trees in front of the windows of the townhouses, and that would protect their privacy as well as ensure that it's a pleasant experience for the pedestrian. So I think this is where we need to be. This is the kind of landscape that we want for people. This is built for people, not for cars. It's built for a modern era where we want people to walk, we want people to cycle, we want them to be able to feel comfortable in the space, and I think that this project meets those goals. And I hope that future development is consistent with those kinds of goals, that it does create a pleasant, walkable community, especially in the commercial zones, because that's where most of us will go to, right? That's where we get together, in the commercial zones. We walk to the villages to be with each other and to socialize and connect. And most urban spaces that have comfortable green urban environments or gathering spaces, they do encourage people to walk and cycle. It becomes a pleasant place to be. And I think that this project meets those goals. And I'm frustrated to hear that, like, you support density, but you don't support it on a major thoroughfare. You support you talk about the FAR being too high, but at the same time, where else are we going to meet these needs? Where else are we going to find the space for housing? And, we have, your letter you quoted was talking about catering to the social needs of society. We need to build housing. The need right now is housing, and there isn't enough. And the more we create supply, the more it becomes accessible to more people and creates space for people to downsize to, so that those houses, those single family houses that we have a plethora of, will be filled with families and eventually, shared spaces. And I wish, too, as well, I think I heard it from everybody, that we could have a community amenity of affordable units in this building, but that toolkit wasn't available to us. And it's not yet there. We're getting there as a community, but I think we heard that loud and clear. And I think that can be a message that we take and we move forward on an initiative like that and change our zoning and our DCC bylaws so that we can ensure that happens going forward. And Airbnb is actually illegal already, so I don't think we need to be concerned that this building will be filled with Airbnbs. I do believe people respect our bylaws. And finally, I also I forgot to mention that this improvement to the site, not only for the walkability and the safety of the intersection, which were some of my primary reasons at first for supporting it, but we need the tax dollars. It'd be irresponsible for us to pass up an opportunity to increase the tax base when we have a deficit as large as we do in infrastructure. I think this is a responsible way to develop and create space for people as well as ensuring that this community remains sustainable. We have to think the long term. It's putting off development, puts off change, yes. And nobody likes, well, a lot of people don't like change. But it also puts off the increase in our tax base. And that means putting off improvements to infrastructure. That leaves it to our children to pick up the bill. And I don't think that's fair. I think that we need to allow some change and make space for some change so that they aren't left holding an impossible situation with maintenance of our infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Any other second-time speakers? I've seen Councillor Zelko. Okay, Councillor Zelko, second time, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. In the town of Coston, spelt remarkably the same spelling as our former mayor. I don't think this has anything to do with our former mayor, but in the town of Coston, on an Airbnb website, you can get a building in a house that looks remarkably like an Uplands house for $350 a night. And another house in Oak Bay for $300 a night. And an oceanfront Uplands house for $599 a night. And there are more. These are valid listings, not necessarily legal listings, but they're valid listings available today on the website in contravention probably to our bylaws. So if I was going to, let me put it this way, I don't think I would say that everyone in Oak Bay obeys our bylaws. That's not a statement that I would say. 3 points I want to make, if I may. 3 more points. The canopy, I appreciate the fact that so much attention was paid to landscaping, but the canopy will not exist in full for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. I have to wonder what the building will look like for at least the first 10 years, since it is built out essentially to the property line. And that concerns me. The cost, what I'm going to refer to as the cost to the neighbors to the north with respect to the shadowing. If that shadow of the 5th floor nose was moved to be shadowing the secret garden instead, in other words, the shadow of the building at the exact same density with the exact same business plan was simply adjusted so that the people to the north were not paying the cost with respect to lack of sunlight. And instead, the secret garden became maybe with different landscaping, a shade garden with secret aspects to it. And for those who don't know, the secret garden is the advertising that's out there, unfortunately, for this building. I would love to see the shadowing cost be kept on site. If that happened, I would be fine for the building to go up even higher, so that the building itself was not putting more of an impact on the neighbors. Possibly with another floor, I wonder whether some of the community amenity aspects could be more appropriately handled, in my estimation. As I've been learning more and more about community amenities, what I find out is that we have to negotiate, do not impose, avoid the perception that zoning is for sale. Certainly want to avoid that perception. However, the Local Government Act does allow us to create guidelines for density bonusing, but that's not zoning for sale. That's something that's allowed by the Act. Where we would put these in place is in something called a housing strategy. I want to have a housing strategy as quickly as possible, and I don't understand why it keeps being pushed to the back burner. I would like to see our OCP, all the zoning and all the guidelines with respect to the OCP modernized, as I hear many of my council colleagues say a number of times. I have to agree with them. But I don't understand when votes are taken and things like housing policies are pushed to the back burner, essentially making it more and more difficult for renters to stay in Oak Bay. I don't understand that. On balance of things, I have to remind my colleagues that this is not, because of the limitations on us with respect to the various acts, and where we cannot say sort of yes and sort of no, we have to say yes or no, that effectively this is how negotiations occur within the limitations of the act. Because we can't sell zoning, and we don't want to sell zoning or density, but this is how negotiations occur. So I will be voting against this proposal, not because I think it's bad. I think there's a lot of good things here, and as I say, I want to. I find the density defensible. In fact, I would like the proponent, ideally, to come back with maybe something possibly a bit taller. The reason why I want that is that I'd like to have the second and above floors move back to the property line. I don't want to move the commercial. Commercial needs to be engaged with the street. Perfect. Let's leave the commercial where it is. But all those housing stuff above the commercial that's overhanging to the property line, pull that back, and then the trees on the site can be saved. These are just some of the adjustments I would like to see on the next proposal that comes forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any second-time speakers? Yes, go ahead. No, second-time speakers is just, we're not going to go on a
Do some ad hoc
circle
speaking
or-
here. Sounds
Yeah,
reasonable.
because not everyone may want to speak
Yeah. No, I thank you.
second time.
And
Go ahead,
through you, Mayor,
Councillor.
I appreciate the comments that are being made. I think in some ways we have a divide between what the generalists and the specialists at the table here in terms of certainly the ideal of increased density. And it's funny because I actually agree with most of the things that Councillor Kirby and so forth is saying here. If not here, then where? We need more housing. We need to build. However, there's also the other half of my brain, left or right, I'm not sure which of that is, which also says that we need to also do that within the confines of rules. Density being good does not mean that more density is automatically good. And that's kind of the hard part we're having here right now, is that what's good. And without a housing strategy, we are sitting here having this conversation in the vaguest possible ways, trying to interpret what's said in the OCP. And it's not helpful. I fully agree that that should have been and should still be our top priority to get to. Because the reality is that no aspect of this building is outrageous. I mean, the height aspects of it, totally reasonable. Councillor Ney pointed out that the Carlton House has a 53-foot high maximum height compared to the Chaucer Street, which is down a little bit. That's true, but it's also set 100 feet back from that sidewalk, which is then set another 100 feet or so from the houses across the street from it. There's a substantial difference in the size in terms of setbacks. So the setbacks aren't unreasonable. The stretch along Cadboro Bay Road, certainly, having commercial up adjacent to the sidewalk for a short stretch there makes a certain amount of sense. I could be supportive of that. But having it to the property lines on all sides is the question whether that's reasonable or not. And it's the combination of all of them, of course, that gets the floor area ratio so high that we're here in front of us, and why that is a reasonable benchmark in terms of density. And I think that since we can't give direction to applicants, but I can certainly muse a little bit, much as Councillor Zelka did, in terms of what I would like to see. My primary concerns here are that the Cadboro Bay side, the commercial side portion of it, I understand. I would like to see more of it set back, at least a little bit from the house, so that it more dovetails towards the buildings that are adjacent to it. Primarily, my concerns are on the and set back from the street a little bit, so there isn't a couple of 100 feet of vertical wall there. The other piece of that, really my primary concern is on the Bowker side. I think that building either is a 4-story building that is set back appropriately, so it's more in line with some of the other buildings. I don't think 35 feet is necessary. I buy into the notion that we can increase in density. But I think if we're going to have that close to the street. It should be more of a townhouse style or something more of a low rise to reflect the nature of that street. When the concern was raised early in one of the meetings, that was raised as a suggestion that probably makes sense for the opposite side of the street to become townhouses as well, so they would mirror each other's fairly well. And I could certainly see that being logical, but again, that conversation should be part of a community planning process, not sitting here at a table deciding the future of an entire neighborhood over the course of a single building. So I think, I think it's fairly straightforward here that the split is on council and probably not going to come back. But I would point out that all of the aspects being talked about here, the density, the importance of the community, the need for livability, the community building portions of this, were equally valid for Oak Bay Lodge, if not more so. That actually had hundreds of jobs at stake and had hundreds of residents at the most need in our community that were not allowed at a building much smaller than this one being proposed. Well, a bigger building, but on a much larger piece of land. Much smaller impact on the community. So I appreciate that the process here may have been better, but I also think that we have to judge the buildings and the application of the merits, because at the end of the day, the process will be far behind us in 20 years, but the buildings will long be here, still standing and looking at us. So I haven't heard any specifics to any of my concerns. I've heard, again, density is good, more density is better. I'm not sure that sways my opinion on this, that it still feels too large, using the setbacks, the height, the FAR as guidelines. Again, no one of those being particularly egregious, but the combination thereof feels too large to me, even including the forward-looking portions of the OCP. I think the guidelines that are there are sufficient to me to indicate that it's not what was intended for a transitional zone between multifamily, commercial, and single-family residences. So I look forward to hearing more comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other second speakers? I see no other second speakers. Thank you very much. I'm just going to close it off now and make a few remarks. Let me start by referring to the process that we've undergone through, in particular, the work of our 2 volunteer committees and the public hearing and what's on here tonight. We rely a lot on our volunteer committees, the advisory design panel. People put a lot of work and a lot of expertise to the issues that are before them. Same thing with the Planning Commission, the Advisory Planning Commission, ADP, APC, sorry, I get those two mixed up. They put a lot of time in, and they're diligent, and they're as concerned about our community as all the 7 of us are up here. They looked at this, both of those committees looked at this twice. In fact, between the first time they looked at it and the second time, there was significant changes. I won't go into those. They've already been referred to by Councillor Ney, and they were significant. The developer was listening. I want to comment on the public hearing. That was a public hearing that I think we as a community could all be very proud of. It was respectful. It was thoughtful. People came forward with passionate positions, but they listened to each other. And so I think that's very unique to our community, that we work together. And I think that level of respect that we saw is what you see here tonight also. That there's been some thoughtful analysis. We're not all in agreement. Some people like density, some people don't like density. Some people say it could go higher, some people say it shouldn't be that high. But we've all put our minds together for one object, and that object is the good of our community. So whatever the vote turns out to be, I think as a community, having gone through this process with volunteer committees, with people coming out to speak to us at Committee of the Whole, the public hearing, and tonight, is something that says a lot about the uniqueness and the strength of our community working together. And I'm grateful, I'm very proud of that community. And we live in a wonderful community. But Oak Bay is an evolving community. For millennium, as we know, thousands of years, this was the home of First Nations. And subsequent to European contact, there has been an evolution over the last 150 or more years. And it's been a relatively slow evolution. I think that's something that marks us as a community. We moved from First Nations area to the farmlands. And then we moved from the far lands to what I would describe as a remote village. It's not very remote anymore from Victoria, but when you had to have a horse and buggy or you had to walk out here, we were fairly remote. And there was actually a reason why they put the Chinese cemetery out here. And that was because they didn't want it anywhere else, and they thought the land in Oak Bay will never be of any value. So let's put it out there. So we've evolved from the large farmlands to a rural, somewhat a rural village, and from there we started in the early 1900s to evolve as an urban area. And that was in part because it was based on, at that time, the streetcar. We were lucky that we have this village, which was built around the streetcar. It's compact, and what's interesting about it is all other communities that are now designing want what we have here, and they try to artificially develop it. Here, it happened naturally. And we've had a very slow and steady evolution of our homes and the buildings in our area, with a few exceptions. There was the very large boom in the 1910 to 1912, 13, when we saw here in Oak Bay a huge number of houses built, probably the biggest time ever in terms of the number of single-family dwellings. Another boom was when the fairgrounds were closed down and then divided into lots. And then, of course, when the North Henderson was eventually developed and where farmland was turned into a residential. So we have had, with those exceptions, the big steps forward. We've been slow, we've been steady. But over the last 10 years, we haven't been terribly steady. The last 5 years, where our growth pattern, I think it was referred to as 5%, it's 0.5%. That's an oops, but so we have agreed for quite some time as a municipal council to work together with our regional partners, and to accept a 0.5% growth annually, which works out to about 90 people. 90 people. In the last 5 years, that means we should have been in a position to take in 450 people. We took in 79. The prior 5 years, that we took in just over 100. And part of the reason is our bylaws. And we do have an obligation under the regional growth strategy to consider those bylaws so we can make it as such that we can grow by these 90 people. I just want to turn a little bit to how also we evolved, but we've evolved now, I think, in 3 different areas. We first of all evolved around the streetcar. We then, many of the houses after that were built around the car. But it's quite clear that the people that are moving into Oak Bay now are evolving into very significantly different community that they want. It has to be walkable, it has to be bikeable. And a lot of people settled in our community because of that, because they can commute by cycle downtown. So different growth patterns and different types of growth are determined by the current times. And we are moving into times where there's less reliance on the car. And here's an interesting example of that. Hamilton was built under the old parking bylaws, which still exist, which essentially are 2 parking spaces per unit. And that what happened in the Hamilton, they built those, and when you go look now, only half of them are full. So we have been for a long time overbuilding our parking because we haven't kept current with the current trends of people reducing the reliance on the car. So we have had, pursuant to our own official community plan and pursuant to the regional growth strategy, a reasoned planned growth. And that was emphasized in the official community plan that's been referred to quite a number of times. It took about 2 years to develop, Its original plan was done in the mid-'80s, was updated in about 1997, but was with major review of that in the first, when the last council looked at it. It took 2 years. Over 4,000 voices were heard in that process. The plan passed unanimously. Again, the plan is based on reasoned, planned growth. And this is, in fact, the first real test of that official community plan. And one of the things that came out of the public hearing was a statement that the way the official community plan works is it overrides the bylaws, in a sense that the bylaws have to comply with the official community plan, not the other way around. So we start with the official community plan. And so really the question for me is, does this proposed bylaw change align with the community plan? There's another question then after that, if depending on what the conclusion is, that does it fit at this location and in the neighborhood? So I'm just going to look at the first question, and that is, do these changes to the bylaw align with the community plan? And I know this may not be that exciting, but I'm going to quote from some of the provisions which I think are important in the official community plan. The first one comes under the goals generally of the community plan. It's early on in the document. And under housing, it says, encourage and support the development of diverse and inclusive housing options that accommodate residents of all ages, incomes, and family situations, including those with special needs. That's our goal. So the question is, does this change in the bylaw accord with that goal? And it is diverse housing. It does increase the stock, and it will be available to a variety of income levels. It's not what in other communities call affordable, but it is what some people often call is attainable. I next want to turn to the broad objectives of the OCP. And there's something to be said for some of these. I'm not going to necessarily read them all out or all completely. Number one, broad objective. Consider increases in density while respecting the values that make Oak Bay an attractive, environmentally rich community. 2, follow the existing pattern of land use in general, considering some expansion of higher density uses in areas set out in this plan. And in this plan, when you go to the back, it has multifamily dwelling in this area. It is part of that plan. Another objective is to support a limited and well-managed increases in commercial use to support the needs of residents and visitors. Right now, the commercial use on that corner is moribund, and it really doesn't serve the neighbors. The plan is, in this commercial use that's proposed, it will serve the neighbors. And lastly, plan for well-managed growth that adapts to changing population characteristics and lifestyles. And that's my reference earlier. Lifestyles are changing. And we have to be, not necessarily the bleeding edge, but we have to be part of that, and we have to recognize that. Next, I want to turn to some, what they called, that was the broad objectives. These are the broad policies, and there's a lot of them that are relevant, but I just want to refer to a few of them. BP1, as it's euphemistically known, encourage modest population growth, anticipating an annual growth rate of 0.5%. And as I mentioned earlier, we're nowhere near that. In the last 10 years, we should have had approximately 900 more residents. We've had just under 200. And it goes on with the recognition that actual growth fluctuates over time and is based on many external factors. BP3, accommodate future growth in general in areas that are already developed in order to retain Oak Bay's natural parks and open space and environment. This is an area that's already developed. There is a building right to the property line here. And then the last one I'm going to quote in this section is BP3. BP4, sorry. That was BP3 I just read. Encouraged mixed-use development, integrating commercial and residential uses in villages and other commercial areas to increase the vibrancy and economic vitality of those areas. And we've heard that this will do that meet that very objective. And now there's, at page 91, we have some commercial and mixed-use wording. And I do appreciate that there's limitations on it, and I don't disagree with what Councillor Murdoch has said. But the broader principles are contained in something called mixed-use areas, and in particular, the policy number 6. Consider new mixed-use buildings adjacent to or on corners facing existing commercial or mixed buildings in areas near existing villages and along arterial and collector roads where appropriate. This is from what we in Oak Bay called a high-use arterial. I suspect if you came from Vancouver, this would be a quiet residential street, but it's all relative to what we get used to. We consider this a high-use arterial. That's exactly where this is planned for. And then finally, the multi-unit residential areas, that's at page 91, which talks about a number of different housing policies. I'll just refer to 19, 20, and 21 specifically. Consider limited expansion of multi-unit residential areas beyond the areas designated as multi-unit residential. Consider use of density bonus in exchange for community amenities, which has been referred to by my colleague, Councillor Zelka. And I'm going to stop there and saying there has been some amenities offered. Whether or not that's appropriate or they're sufficient, it's up to the developer to come to grips with that. But we have heard the need to fix that intersection. In fact, at the very first committee of the whole, people lined up at the microphone, not against the project, but against the intersection, with a plea that please fix the intersection. They weren't so concerned, at least in that first meeting, about the building, what was going to go on. They wanted the intersection fixed. And it is my fervent hope that if this goes ahead, the developer will do just that. And then finally, H21. Place parking underground and below grade on larger projects with higher densities. For smaller projects where the parking is at grade, locate the parking lots or parking garages behind the building, away from the primary street. And that's what's suggested here. So the conclusion that I come to when I reviewed all of those is there is good alignment between what is being proposed as a bylaw and what we have set out as how we want our community to develop. Now, the next question would be for me, does it fit at this location in this particular neighborhood? And part of that I'll come back and I'll talk about the precedent or the new normal, as one speaker referred to. And we have had different views on the design. There's no question about that. And so this is really, for me, if you could call it, I would call it an architectural fit or a community fit. Kind of it overlaps those two. And we had residents lining up in the public hearing saying, yes, this fits in perfectly. Others say, no, it doesn't fit in at all. So, just addressing the architectural fit. I am not a designer. One of the community groups that we use is populated by designers and architects, the advisory design panel, and they have supported this. I trust their judgment. I also trust the judgment of our staff on this aspect, that this is not so out of keeping. And I think I even heard Councillor Murdoch, he said, there's nothing outrageous about this building. You may disagree with it, but people disagree about art. People disagree about form. But we have had what I consider certainly the best available advice here. And we also have to put our trust in an architect who has a reputation in the community to uphold, and who's shown by previous designs here in our community, particularly the Clive, that he's up to it. So I think from my way of thinking, I'm not a designer, but I'm going to rely on the opinions that have been expressed to us about that. So there's other fits, and one of them is the question of arterial. Where else are you going to put something like this? And I did hear that coming from Councillor Kirby, and I agree with her on that point. Now, what about precedent? Will this form a new precedent? Will this all of a sudden lead to similar buildings up and down Cadboro Bay? The simple answer is no. One of the things I do know a lot about, I'm not an expert designer, but I do know a lot about precedent. I spent my working life as a lawyer worrying about precedent, looking up precedents, applying them, and even now I'm teaching the whole issue of precedents. And what you look for when you look for precedents, what are the main characteristics of the site and the building that would allow someone to come forward and say, well, I have exactly the same characteristics on my lot. I should be allowed to build exactly what abstract, because that's really the precedent that we are concerned about. We might be concerned about. So look at it. The characteristics for me in respect of that building are, it's a secondary village. And that's very important. And that, to some extent, drives the height, because commercial heights, as we've heard, are higher, or the floors, I should say, are higher than residential floors. Another important aspect is the arterial road that it's on. And thirdly, for me, that it's flanked. This building is flanked by two buildings that are 4-story already. There are no other sites of that nature, to my knowledge, that meet those three key characteristics, which for me support this building. So is it a new normal? No. It's specific to that lot, much like the Rudyard Kipling was specific to that location. We haven't seen any other Rudyard Kiplings, 10-story co-op buildings anywhere in our community. Why not? Because the Rudyard Kipling was tailored to that site. What about the two Whitehalls and White Houses, the next door to each other? They were tailored for that site. Same thing with the hotel. So there is no precedent in my mind that we should have any concern for here. This, in my view, and we heard from an architect, Mr. DeHogue, the other night, very highly respected architect locally, support this plan. And he wouldn't have come forward had he thought that this was out of keeping with what I would describe as modern urbanism. So, if we find some other place that meets those three conditions, it might be a precedent. But as far as I know, there are none. And so finally, let me reiterate my thoughts on amenities. I think we need that intersection fixed. I think the developer has heard that from this council, has heard it from the neighbors, and I hope that's going to be part of it. Finally, my conclusions, therefore, are the proposed bylaw does align with the official community plan, and it does suit that project. So I'm going to call a question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Braithwaite, Councillor Murdoch, and Councillor Zelka are opposed. It passes. Thank you. But wish that were the end of the night, but it ain't. Okay, let me just pull out my my agenda here, my hard copy. The next one is the issue of final reading. That was third reading, and I think when we met Wednesday night, we were not asked by our staff to go to a final reading, because at that point, it was my understanding that there was outstanding commitments that the applicant had yet made. My understanding, Mr. Jones, is between then and this morning that those outstanding commitments have been met, and they would be things like off-site, not off-site amenities, off-site servicing, as an example. So there are no outstanding issues which would prevent final reading. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Worship.
All right. So I'm going to ask for a motion for final reading, please, or
Move final
adoption, as
reading,
sometimes
or
it's called.
adoption.
Moved.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? Opposed? Zelka, Braithwaite, Murdoch opposed. Thank you very much. That passes. And so, thank you everybody for participating. We do have something else though, as my eyes glance down down here, and that is we do have first, second, and third reading of the village housing. Am I skipping a step here, Ms. Jones? We've gone to that one. Okay, good. And just the note I should make is there will be a development permit coming forward, that should be coming forward the 23rd of March. That's the March, yeah, sorry. That'd be May. It starts with M, but ends differently. So the development permit with variances will be coming forward next week. No, 2 weeks from 9 plus 1. Thank you. Plus 1 day. All right. We next have the Bowker Village Housing Agreement that's been referred to, and this includes the prohibition from banning rentals. In other words, requiring that rentals be available. All right. So we need, and we can have first, second, and third reading for this, and then a discussion if it's necessary.
Move first, second, and third reading of bylaw 4690.
Seconded.
Thank you very much. Moved and seconded. Discussion, and I assume it really follows the other points that we've made before. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka, and then Councillor Murdoch, please. Oh, sorry, you were just waving. I saw your pen go up. Sorry, out of the corner of that eye. Okay, go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me just get my notes ready, please. Since we're moving forward onto this, my comments related to my concerns. I wanted to raise my concerns about the absolutely no restrictions on rentals, which I believe, let's see if I can get the exact wording here. The owner covenants, I'm talking about section 3.1 in the housing agreement, housing agreement itself. The owner covenants and agrees that the owner shall not take any steps nor enter into any agreements or impose any rules or regulations whatsoever, the effect of which would be to restrict the age of, oh, that's the age, sorry. Oh, I gotta move my note out of the way here. I'm talking about 2.1, I apologize. The owner covenants and agrees that the owner shall not take any steps nor enter into any agreements or impose any rules or regulations whatsoever, the effect of which would be to prevent or restrict the owner of a dwelling unit from renting that dwelling unit for residential purposes to a non-owner. My concern is with the, shall we say, broad nature of this particular provision, especially with the inclusion of the word whatsoever. So let me just sort of state that I have a concern around that. I decided to do some research, and this was long before the public hearing. Unfortunately, this is the very first time that I've seen this housing agreement. It's relatively new, and I actually haven't, I don't know whether it was here at the meeting that I missed, but I didn't hear any of the staff comments related to this housing agreement, so I've been flying a bit blind on this one, as it's relatively new to me. So I had to do some research on my own, and what I've discovered when I look at the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia, they have some pretty strict guidelines with respect to, or guidelines and offers of suggestions to various strata owners, strata corporations, with respect to opening up to rentals, but at the same time having not letting the door open so wide that they can then no longer ban or control the concept of a short-term hotel-like accommodation. Because unfortunately, especially in a lot of people's minds, not necessarily lawyers' minds, lawyers know the difference between a tenancy agreement and a license to occupy. Most people don't know the difference between that. They think it's the same. Renting a hotel room for one day is a license to occupy. That's not a tenancy agreement. The Tenancy Act does not apply. Unfortunately, that's a nuance that as many condominium owners, according to this association, have discovered. So they have offered a number of suggestions that maybe we could, as a community, benefit from. And again, because this is here, and if we approve it, there is no other opportunity to get a word in edgewise. The wording is now fixed. I need to bring my comments forward at this time. So the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia basically say that, as I say, not a week goes by that they don't get called or email about the short-term rentals problem, as they refer to it as. In particular, as I described, the difficulty in people's minds knowing the difference between what's a rental versus what's a short-term accommodation of a building. Many condominium owners have proposed various different provisions in their strata rules to get a handle on this, some more successful than others. And the proposal from the Condominium Home Builders Association, as they go into the details of, in fact, they even go on to explain. I'm sure any lawyers in the crowd would love how they describe with much too much detail the difference between a lease and a license. But with respect to that nuance, changing the occupancy of a strata lot, according to these people, does not trigger the requirement to provide a Form K, and therefore the rental bylaw is not effective. Now, as I say, lawyers would understand this. So they talk about what is the most effective type of bylaw to prevent short-term rentals is one that specifically prohibits short-term accommodation, hotel-like uses, or motel-like uses, or bed and breakfasts, or type accommodations of that type. So that is a concern that I have. And since we're moving forward with this property, with the bylaw, I wanted to propose certain wordings with respect to that.
Could just before you do that, could we just, because I think we all appreciate your concern, and the question is, can it be dealt with in other ways, right, to deal with this concern? Or is it being dealt with? So can we just hear from staff what the thoughts are on how these are generally dealt with? Please.
Yeah, Your Worship, this document that's in front of you, the housing agreement, was actually prepared by legal counsel. Those issues were discussed with respect to what do we consider to be rental accommodation. So the agreement is prepared very much for the case of no restrictions will be put on rental of those units. The length of time on the rental of those units comes back to the zoning bylaw. So at this point in time, we do not provide for transient accommodation. It is very much prohibited through the zoning bylaw. The courts have historically considered transient accommodation, or whatever the definition is for the various municipalities, as being at 30 days. So our bylaw, as it stands, would not allow for rental accommodation less than 30 days.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if that satisfies you, that we've got it covered.
That is very helpful to know. However, if I may continue.
Yes.
As this Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia have noted, many municipalities have done little to enforce their bylaws. We here in Oak Bay force only on, how do I say this, we don't have a full-time person walking around looking for these sort of things. We enforce on a complaint basis. And even at that time, the enforcement of the business usage of something that's supposed to be residential, the cost of that, who bears the cost? So it seems to be a concern raised by a number of corporations. I would not want that to be something that would, how do I say, in the public hearing, what I heard was a lot of aspirational statements on how these buildings, how these units would be potentially used, whether it's purchased or residential, by the children, by the age-friendly aspect, so something to sell your house and move into. And essentially, it would be a building that would be occupied by people who are here, ideally longer than 30 days. Preferably longer. Preferably I mean, I can imagine, you know, 4 to 5 month rentals for the students. I'd have no problems with that. A place could potentially be rented for 4 to 5 months. I would prefer in Oak Bay that we define short-term rental to be more than 30 days in general, even though the courts or maybe the case law talks about what their definition is in general. I would like to see a made in Oak Bay solution as to what does short-term rental mean, because this doesn't really address it. And we're relying upon case law, we're relying on lawyers, we're relying on expenses, we're relying on a number of enforcements and different ways of sort of dealing with it. Whereas potentially we could just deal with it right up front with the strata corporation themselves. We're given the tools to deal with a potential problem that a number of our stratas have already encountered. So I would be open to possibly referring this back to staff, asking for a legal, a more thorough legal definition with respect to some of the comments brought forward by the other condominium owners, and how we can, as a district, ensure that this building is not well occupied by couch surfers, by short-term rentals, by potentially those who may want to use it for other purposes.
All right. We need a motion for that. Just go ahead, Councillor Murdoch, before we have a motion.
Before we have a motion.
Because we do have we actually have a motion on the floor.
For first reading.
So so that's the first, second, and third readings, right? Yeah. So we would have to table that and refer the issue back, correct? Well, that would be the process if the council is so inclined. Thank you.
So
Councillor Murdoch.
this is sort of slightly tangential to the core of the approval. So I think a little bit of time on this. I agree with what Councillor Zalka has spoken to. It would be nice to have, given the difficulty of enforcing within the bylaws, to have something in writing within the strata itself. If that's the will of council, and the applicant is amenable to restricting those. I would think that would make it logical to have it as part of this, so that it would form part of the strata corporation. It would form part of their rules inherent that they couldn't do it. It's much easier for a strata corporation just to enforce having been on a strata council before, it's much easier for them to just enforce an in-house rule than it is, and they could use the housing agreement as ammunition for that. They can't vary that. So I'd be amenable to seeing that put in. I guess is there any harm here in just asking, and I guess the vote here would be to defer, and that would be the indication that the majority of council feel that there's merit in reinforcing the longer term rental aspect of the rentals in the building. If there are, then that's probably the appropriate motion. If there isn't a majority, then obviously there's enough comfort here that the short term rentals being enforced as they are is good. So,
if I could just interject here, my thought is that this is going to be self-policing by the owners and the strata. From my small experience with strata owners, they're kind of like street superintendents. They keep their eye on everything, and if they do see this, I'm sure that will be brought to not only the strata council's attention but to our attention. And I think all we possibly need to do is once the strata title council is formed for the first time, we can send them some materials from our department letting them know what the laws are in respect to short and long term. That's just a practical solution that may not require any legislative changes, which I think is what I'm hearing now. Councillor Croft and back to Councillor Murdoch, please.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. I agree that the building would be self-policing. Also, there's a layer that's not here because it hasn't been dealt with yet with the developer and the the government who will issue the strata, is that there will be a strata bylaws that could also have more enforcement in it than what we see in this housing agreement.
Okay. Councillor Murdoch, please.
Well, I guess the problem I have right now is that we're in the very awkward notion of having this discussion without any input from the applicant or from, it's just kind of, this is the wrong kind of moment to be having this piece. I'm going to make a motion to refer this just back to staff to come back to to a council meeting where we can just have some input from if the developer is comfortable with the way it is and has justification for it, I'm fine with that. If the staff are okay with it, I'm okay with that. I would just like to have the conversation. So in the quickest possible time frame for it to go away and come back to the next council meeting, that's my comfort level, just so we can have a conversation. So I'll make a motion to defer.
Okay. Is that possible, or for all we know, it may have already been considered by the lawyers? Can this come back if we refer this? Can it come back May 23rd? And what's being suggested?
Your Worship, if you wouldn't mind if staff have a brief moment to confer before the commitment is made.
Absolutely.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. We don't want to put anyone on the spot any more than we have to. What's that? Yeah, it's to refer, it's not to table. There's one's referring back to staff where they do some more work, and one is just
Your Worship,
the jury has come back with a decision?
I'm the spokesperson for the jury. Staff see no problem having this come back. We can't guarantee it's going to be on the 23rd, just because we'll have to work with the proponent to try to come up with some language, and that'll have to be referred to lawyers on both sides and agreed to.
Okay, and I assume that there's no urgency with this aspect. Is there, that it could happen sometime in June if it comes to that?
Thank you, Your Worship. We're just passing the hat of reference back and forth here a little bit. There is one future item coming still to the 23rd, which is the development permit with variances. So again, staff would do their best to have this all back to the 23rd, but can't make this
All right,
commitment.
I think that's reasonable then. So it can come back on the 23rd. So I think we're ready for the question, and that's to refer. Okay, I think there's probably a consensus that we're going to refer it. So. All right, go ahead.
As long as I'm allowed to discuss a referral, is that all right?
You can discuss the referral.
Thank you very much. I wish to support the referral. I note that this housing agreement it defines the tenancy agreement, but it doesn't use the term tenancy agreement. Whereas it doesn't define what residential purposes is. So it's sort of there's some inconsistencies in here that I worry about, and I'm hoping that this referral will help to solidify and possibly patch some holes, because God forbid we end up disappointing those who have aspirations to live in this building, only to find out that there's no room for them. I would not want to see that happen. I would wonder whether residential purposes needs to be defined, specifically prohibiting short-term accommodations, hotel-like uses, motel-like uses, bed and breakfast, or similar uses. And I would like to see short-term be defined as 4 months or less. That's the type of comments I would like to add in terms of the referral. Thank you.
Okay, it's not contained in the referral, but your thoughts will be captured by staff, and looking at some of the options. Okay, so this is a referral. It'll come back on May 23rd. Are we ready? All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Kirby's opposed. Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. I apologize. Councillor Croft's opposed to. So it'll come back May 23rd or as soon thereafter as is humanly possible. Now, we have come to the end of the special meeting.
Move
Move
adjournment.
adjournment.
Okay, moved, seconded. All in favor? Opposed? Unopposed. We are going to take a break so people can leave. I don't think you were asking our permission there, were you? Okay, so if you wouldn't mind,